What if I told you that before human history even began, Earth was ruled by just 8 kings, and their reign lasted for 241,200 years? This isn't a fantasy novel. It's written in one of the oldest texts ever discovered, an ancient Sumerian document that systematically dismantles our entire understanding of history. Tonight, we're going to explore what historians have spent over a century trying to explain away, and the physical evidence they cannot deny. You see, for over a century, the evidence for a pre-human civilization has been sitting in a museum, inscribed on a small, unassuming block of baked clay called the Weld-Blundell Prism. This artifact is the starting point for our journey tonight, and it changes everything. It sits quietly in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and yet its implications have reverberated through academia like an unspoken secret that everyone knows but refuses to speak aloud. The prism is not a singular source either. Multiple versions exist across ancient texts and fragments scattered throughout the world's greatest museums. The King List dynasties, copies in various collections, each one meticulously preserved by ancient scribes who understood they were recording something of profound importance. The consistency across these sources is not accidental. It is deliberate. It is intentional. It speaks to a unified effort to maintain a record. By the end of this journey, the greatest lie in history won't be the existence of gods, but why they hid it. The cover-up wasn't performed by modern institutions alone. It began in antiquity itself, woven into the very fabric of how civilization chose to remember itself. And the Sumerian King List is the crack in that carefully constructed narrative, the moment when the hidden architects forgot to fully erase the evidence of what came before. This is the ancient Sumerian Kings List, their 241,200-year reign on Earth, and why they hid it. Leave a like and stay with me as we step into the darkness. When archaeologists first uncovered fragments of the Sumerian King List in the late 1800s, they faced an immediate and profound problem. The text listed several monarchs with reign lengths that were astronomical in their scope. King Alulim ruled for 67,200 years. King Allogar followed with 36,000 years. These figures were incomprehensible when measured against human timescales. These numbers seemed to occupy an entirely different category of chronology. Modern scholarship had only one response to these impossibilities: mythologize them entirely. The historians made a curious and revealing decision. They would validate the post-flood kings, the ones who appeared in later records and could be cross-referenced with archaeological sites and written traditions. Kings like Gilgamesh, Aga, and Enmebaragesi would be deemed historical because their reign lengths, while still extended by modern standards, fell within the theoretical range of exceptional human longevity. Gilgamesh, for instance, ruled for 126 years. This was manageable. It was explainable through exaggeration or through rare cases of extended lifespans in antiquity. These kings appeared in later texts and folklore. Their cities could be archaeologically verified. Lagash, Uruk, these places existed. They left ruins. They left inscriptions. They left artifacts. So the post-flood kings were deemed historical without hesitation, but the 8 antediluvian, the pre-flood kings, they were dismissed outright as mythology, as fantasy, as the embellished dreams of a primitive people who didn't understand chronology or mathematical precision. Academic consensus crystallized around a single interpretation. The earlier section was legendary invention, while the later section was historical record. This division became so established that it shaped every subsequent study of the text. This is where the central paradox reveals itself with stunning clarity. The Sumerian King List does not read like mythology. It does not speak of gods walking the earth with their heroic exploits and miraculous adventures. The text is remarkably clinical in its presentation throughout. It lists a king, his capital city, his reign length in precise numbers, and then moves methodically to the next without any flourish or theological commentary. In Eridu, Alulim reigned. 67,200 years passed. Then the throne moved. The language is bureaucratic, almost administrative in its coldness. It reads like a ledger, like a bureaucratic record, not like a legend crafted to inspire wonder. Consider the logical contradiction. Historians trust the mythological tradition when it supports the post-flood narrative. They accept that King Lugalanda of Lagash existed because inscriptions confirm his existence. They accept that Ur-Nammu built the Great Ziggurat because the structure survives. Yet when the same document, written in identical language, following identical organizational principles, and using identical formatting presents them with the pre-flood kings, they collectively agree this section must be discarded as unreliable. They reject it as fabrication. Why? What basis justifies this selective trust? The historian's dilemma is not actually a historical problem. It is not a problem of evidence or methodology. It is a cognitive problem, a psychological boundary. The numbers are too large. The timescale is too alien to human experience. The implications are too profound. They shatter the comfortable narrative of gradual human progress. So rather than investigate the contradiction, rather than follow the evidence wherever it might lead, they resolved it through assumption and declaration. They decided that one part of the text could be trusted and the other could not. They made this determination not based on evidence, but based on what fit the acceptable boundaries of human history, on what could be comfortably integrated into existing frameworks. But what if the paradox exists, not because the pre-flood kings are fabricated, but because we have fundamentally, radically misunderstood what the word king means when applied to non-human entities with different biological structures, different lifespans, and different relationships to time itself? The Weld-Blundell Prism sits in its museum case, and the scribes who copied it, generation after generation across centuries, knew exactly what they were preserving. They did not mark the transition from pre-flood to post-flood with any indication that the text changed character or altered its meaning. There is no note saying, "Here ends the mythological section," or "Here begins the reliable history." The continuity is deliberate and consistent. The form is consistent throughout. The medium is the message. This is one unified record, a single integrated chronicle, and its systematic rejection was the choice of modern minds, not ancient historians. The conspiracy begins here, at the moment when modern scholarship chose convenience over investigation. We inherited an interpretation that was itself constructed, filtered through centuries of political motive and theological recontextualization. We did not discover that the pre-flood kings were mythological. We were taught this as if it were a conclusion reached through rigorous analysis. But the analysis was never performed. The assumption was never questioned. The paradox was declared closed through declaration, not through evidence. The paradox collapses when we ask the uncomfortable question that scholarship has avoided. What if the historians were wrong about which part to discard? What if the seemingly impossible numbers represent not exaggeration, but precision? What if the pre-flood kings are not mythology but documented history, recorded in a form that our modern minds have simply failed to comprehend? The evidence has always been here. We simply chose not to see it. To understand what we are truly looking at, what the Sumerian King List actually contains, we must descend into the mathematics of ancient Mesopotamia, a system so elegant, so precise, so deliberate in its construction that it reveals, with absolute clarity, the intentionality behind every single number inscribed on the clay tablets. The Sumerians developed a sexagesimal system, a revolutionary base 60 numbering framework that fundamentally shaped how they perceived and calculated cosmic order. This system still echoes through our modern world in ways most people never recognize. When we divide an hour into precisely 60 minutes, when we segment a circle into 360 degrees, when we measure angles and celestial positions, we are inheriting the mathematical legacy of ancient Sumeria. But the Sumerians applied this system to something infinitely grander than mere timekeeping or geometric measurement. They applied it to the measurement of cosmic time itself, to the vast cycles that govern the heavens and, they believed, the destiny of civilizations. They created a unit of measurement they called the SAR. One Saudi riyal equaled 3,600 years. This was not an arbitrary number selected without reason. 3,600 is the product of 60 multiplied by 60, the sacred multiplication of their base system cascading upward into vast temporal scales that seemed to touch the infinite. It was a number chosen deliberately to reflect celestial order projected onto earthly chronology. It was a mathematical expression of cosmic harmony applied to time itself. When a Sumerian astronomer priest looked at the heavens and calculated the great cycles that governed the cosmos, he would have naturally expressed these measurements in SAR units. Now observe what happens when we examine the reign lengths of the antediluvian kings through this mathematical lens with careful precision. Alulim, first king of Eridu, 67,200 years. Divide this by the SAR of 3,600. 67,200 divided by 3,600 equals exactly 18 2/3 SAR cycles. Not approximate, exactly precise. Exact division without remainder beyond the calculated fraction. Al-Algar, second king, 36,000 years. Divide by 3,600, precisely 10 Saudi riyals. A perfect whole multiple with no deviation whatsoever. Enmenluana, third king, 43,200 years. Divide by 3,600, exactly 12 Saudi riyals, another perfect multiple without exception. Enmengalana, fourth king, 34,000 years. Divide by 3,600, 9 7/8 Saudi riyal, again, a precise calculated fraction. Move methodically through the complete list. Every single reign length adheres to this mathematical framework. Ensipaziana, 28,800 years, precisely 8 SAR. Enmendurana, 21,000 years, exactly 5.833 repeating SAR. Ubaratutu, 18,600 years, 5.166 repeating SAR. Every entry, every king, every reign. Calculated submultiples or multiples of this cosmic unit. The pattern is absolute. The pattern is universal throughout the antediluvian section. This is the smoking gun, and it has been waiting in plain sight for over a century while scholars refuse to see it. When numbers in an ancient text are random exaggerations, when they are products of mythological invention, they are chaotic and inconsistent. A storyteller embellishes wildly without constraint or system. One king rules for 50 years, another 200, another 75, another 1,000. There is no pattern. There is no underlying mathematical structure. But when every single figure in a list adheres to a precise mathematical framework with absolute consistency, when each number divides cleanly and intentionally by a sacred unit, when the fractions themselves are calculated ratios, the numbers cannot possibly be mythological invention. They are calculated records. They are mathematical documentation. The probability of this occurring by accident is vanishingly small, approaching mathematical impossibility. The probability that an ancient culture independently invented a fanciful list where every reign happens to be a perfect multiple or submultiple of their most sacred mathematical unit is so remote that it enters the realm of the genuinely impossible. This is not chance. This is not coincidence. This is design. What this reveals with absolute clarity is that the Sumerian King List was not written to deceive anyone through mythological embellishment. It was written to be read correctly by those who understood the system. The SAR system is the decoder ring. It is the mathematical key that unlocks the true meaning of the document. It proves definitively that the antediluvian king's reign lengths are not exaggerations meant to sound impressive to an uneducated populace. They are coordinates in a temporal system that only makes sense if we accept that these were not human lifespans at all. They are measurements designed for entities with fundamentally different relationships to time and lifespan. The authors of the King List were mathematicians and astronomers of extraordinary sophistication. They understood celestial cycles. They built structures aligned with precision to the stars. They divided the heavens with mathematical exactitude. When they recorded the reigns in multiples of the SAR, they were communicating a deliberate message to posterity, to future generations who possessed the knowledge to interpret their work. This message was, these numbers are not mythical exaggerations. They are calculated. They are real. They represent actual chronological records of entities whose lifespans operated according to different parameters than human beings. The conspiracy begins with a fundamental act of intellectual abandonment. Modern historians could not interpret the mathematics. They did not understand the SAR system in its proper context. They did not recognize the deliberate mathematical structure. Rather than investigate, rather than learn the system that would unlock the meaning, they chose instead to dismiss the mathematics as meaningless. They classified the entire section as mythology and moved on. The truth was encoded in the mathematics, and we forgot the language in which it was written. The Sumerian King List opens with a line that reverberates through the ages like the fundamental note of creation itself. It stands at the absolute beginning of the document, before any king is named, before any city is mentioned, before any chronology begins. The line is this: Kingship descended from heaven. This is not poetic metaphor dressed in theological language. This is not a spiritual platitude about divine favor or cosmic blessing. This is a statement of political origin. This is the foundation myth rewritten as genealogical fact. This is the explanation for why what follows matters. And it appears at the very beginning of the chronological record, positioned deliberately before Alulim, before Eridu, before the first city, before human civilization as we understand it. It is the preamble. It is the explanation. It is the context that everything else must be understood within. In Sumerian theology and cosmology, the descent of kingship from heaven carried extremely precise meaning that modern scholars have often misunderstood or diluted through translation. It did not mean that a king was spiritually chosen by distant gods or that a ruler received divine favor from afar. It meant something far more literal and far more concrete. It meant that authority came literally from above, from a source that originated beyond the terrestrial realm. Kingship was not generated on earth. It was installed from elsewhere. It descended. It came down. It arrived. The Anunnaki, the celestial beings in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the gods who came from the sky, were recorded in the ancient texts as descending from the sky itself. They came from a place called the Ki-en-Gir, interpreted as the place between heaven and earth, or from Anu's realm directly, from the very summit of the cosmic order. The Sumerian King List does not speak of gods in abstract theological terms. It speaks of kingship descending, authority arriving, control being established. Consider the implications of this opening line in conjunction with the mathematical evidence we have now uncovered. The kings who ruled for multiples of the SAR were not human beings. They could not have been human. Their lifespans operated according to principles entirely foreign to human biology. They were entities with fundamentally different lifespans, different biological clocks, different relationships to time itself. The ancient Sumerians knew this with absolute certainty. The text says it plainly, right at the beginning. Kingship descended. It came from elsewhere. It did not emerge from earth. It came to earth. The 8 antediluvian kings were not mortals elevated to political power through military conquest or dynastic succession. They were not human beings who happened to achieve extraordinary longevity through exceptional health or careful living. They were non-human administrators, entities from elsewhere, placed in positions of authority over an emerging civilization on Earth. The length of their reigns, tens of thousands of years, would be incomprehensible, even impossible, For human beings with standard human biology, the human body accumulates damage, it ages, it declines. After a certain number of decades, it fails. No human being has ever lived beyond about 120 years, and that represents an extreme outlier. The idea that a human being could rule for 67,200 years is not merely unlikely. It is biologically impossible. But for entities whose existence operated on a completely different scale, whose aging process, if they aged at all, followed different laws, whose cellular regeneration or biological maintenance operated according to different principles, whose very relationship to time might be fundamentally distinct from human experience. For such entities, these timescales become not only conceivable, but logical. They become the expected range for biological beings whose parameters are radically different. The phrase, "kingship descended from heaven," is the ancient admission of what we are seeing in the numbers. It is the architects of the text pointing toward the truth with crystalline clarity before they carefully buried it in chronological detail and mathematical precision. They are telling us, right at the beginning, what follows is not human history. What follows is a record of non-human administration. What follows is the chronicle of beings who came from the sky and ruled the earth. This is the first clear evidence of the conspiracy, not the falsification of records, not the destruction of evidence, not the deliberate creation of lies. The conspiracy involved the deliberate encoding of information in a form that only those who possessed the proper knowledge could decode. The general population, reading the King List without knowledge of the SAR system, without understanding the Anunnaki cosmology, without comprehending the theological context of the original Sumerian worldview, would see only impossibly large numbers that made no sense. They would set it aside as mythology. They would believe that their ancestors had invented fantastic stories about ancient kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time. The truth would remain hidden in plain sight, preserved in the structure of the numbers themselves, legible only to those who possessed the key. And that key, that fundamental decoder, was mathematics. The language of those who came from heaven was always mathematics, always precision, always the SAR. The beings who descended from the sky were not primitive or magical or mysterious. They were technological, they were systematic, they were mathematical, they communicated through numbers, they organized time through the SAR. They recorded their administration through precise chronological documentation. And when the post-flood dynasties inherited this record, they understood that it was too powerful to destroy, but too dangerous to fully explain. To understand what we are truly examining in the Sumerian King List, we must construct a scenario that contradicts almost everything we have been taught about civilization's origins and the nature of human development. We must imagine a radically different narrative of how human civilization began. Most historical and archaeological narratives assume that civilization emerged organically through a slow, incremental process spanning many thousands of years. Humans gradually aggregated into larger groups. They learned agriculture through trial and error, through generations of experimentation and failure and gradual refinement. They developed writing through slow evolution from pictographs to increasingly abstract symbolic systems. They organized themselves into hierarchies through natural processes of social differentiation, resource competition, and the gradual accumulation of power. They developed technology through endless cycles of invention and refinement. This is the bottom-up theory of civilization. It is comfortable to modern sensibilities. It is comprehensible within our work of understanding. It places humanity at the center of our own story, as the authors of our own destiny. We did this. We invented agriculture. We created writing. We built civilization. The Sumerian King List suggests something radically and fundamentally different. It suggests that civilization was not organically developed. Civilization was installed, it was constructed, it was placed into position from above by external entities according to a pre-existing blueprint. It did not emerge. It descended. It arrived fully formed, complete with cities, with administrative structures, with technological systems, with organized purpose. The text begins not with the gradual founding of a city by human settlers, working to build shelter and establish agricultural fields. It begins with the descent of kingship and the immediate establishment of Eridu as the first capital. There is no narrative of a city slowly growing from a small settlement. Eridu appears in the record as a fully functional administrative center, purpose-built, with clear organizational structure and defined role within a larger system. Eridu, in Sumerian tradition, was called the City of the First King, and more significantly, was dedicated to Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and technological knowledge. Enki was the entity most directly associated with technology transfer, with the teaching of civilization to humans, with the installation of ordered systems. Eridu was not a settlement that grew organically from a random location where humans happened to gather. It was a constructed administrative center, placed at a specific location according to deliberate geographic strategy, with a specific purpose that fit within a larger continental plan. It was selected and positioned by intelligence, acting with foresight and planning. The location was chosen because it controlled crucial waterways, because it could serve as a hub for communication networks, because it occupied a position of geographic advantage in a system that was being established across a far larger territory than any single city. The two first kings, Alulim and Alalgar, ruled Eridu for a combined total of 103,200 years, representing over 28 SAR cycles. This was not a period of experimentation or development or trial and error. This was an extended period of institutional stability, of infrastructure being deliberately laid down, of fundamental systems being established and debugged and refined. An installed operating system requires a long initialization period before it becomes fully stable and begins to function smoothly. The civilization that began at Eridu was precisely this: a system being set up, being tested, being debugged, and being made fundamentally stable and reliable. The extended reign of Alulim and Alalgar was not unusual or problematic. It was necessary. It was the initialization phase. The reign of Alulim lasted 67,200 years, the longest of all the antediluvian kings. This was not a sign of extraordinary personal longevity or luck. This was the pilot phase, the extended period during which the system was being constructed, monitored, tested, and refined in real time. No major transitions occurred during Alulim's rule because the entire reign was dedicated to the act of creation itself, to the physical construction of infrastructure, to the establishment of administrative protocols, to the laying down of the foundational systems that would support everything that came after. Then Alalgar took the throne for 36,000 years, continuing the work, a period during which the system was deepened, refined, and carefully prepared for the subsequent phase of expansion and specialization. The cities that came after Eridu in the chronological sequence, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, were not alternatives to Eridu. They were not competing power centers or independent developments. They were deliberate expansions of the same system, each one serving a specific and distinct function in an interconnected continental network. Each city was positioned according to geographic and strategic logic. Each city had a specific purpose that integrated with the larger whole. Each represented a phase of the system's development. This is the architecture of installation, not the slow, chaotic, unpredictable emergence of human civilization through accident and gradual discovery. This is the deliberate, planned, systematic construction of an operating system placed from above by external intelligence, establishing order across Mesopotamia according to a pre-designed blueprint that extended across perhaps the entire terrestrial sphere. The conspiracy begins here, at the moment when those who came after, the post-flood human dynasties, inherited this system but refused to fully acknowledge its non-human origins. They kept the list to legitimize their own rule, to claim continuity with the antediluvian authority, to suggest that they were the rightful heirs to a cosmic order. But they gradually erased the memory of what it truly meant. They transformed the technical record into theology. They told stories about gods instead of acknowledging administrators and engineers. They made the truth disappear behind layers and layers of theological interpretation and mythological embellishment. The record remained visible, but its meaning was obscured. The truth was hidden not through destruction, but through recontextualization. The same numbers, the same chronology, but reframed, reinterpreted, pushed into the realm of legend and mythology. If you're still here listening, leave a like so we know you're following along, and stay with me as we step into the next part of our journey. After a redo, after the extended initialization phase and foundational establishment, the kingship moved to a new city with a dramatically different purpose and character. The text records, then the kingship, moved to Bad Tabira. The name itself is illuminating and speaks volumes to those who understand Sumerian language and culture. Bad Tabira means the fortress of the metalworkers, or the place of foundries, not a city of farmers, not a settlement devoted to artisanal crafts or spiritual worship, not an administrative center devoted to writing and record-keeping, a fortress explicitly dedicated to metallurgy, an industrial center organized around the systematic extraction, processing, and refinement of metals. Bad Tabira was ruled by 3 consecutive kings, Al-Aljar for 36,000 years, Enmen-Lu-Ana for 43,200 years, and Enmen-Gal-Ana for 34,000 years. The combined reign of these 3 kings extended for 113,200 years, representing over 31 SAR cycles. An entire epoch, spanning more than 100,000 years, devoted to a single industrial purpose: the systematic working of metals at scales that dwarf anything humanity achieved until the 20th century. In our modern historical understanding, metallurgy is treated as a relatively recent human discovery, an achievement that emerged only in the final few thousand years of human existence. Bronze Age technology appeared perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Ironworking came even later. Yet the Sumerian King List places an entire era of antediluvian civilization, spanning over 100,000 years, dedicated to metalworking as a central, organizing principle of society. What would require such an extended industrial epoch? What was being produced on such astronomical scales? What possible commodity or resource justification would warrant the devotion of more than 100,000 years to continuous metallurgical processing? The Z-Sitchin hypothesis, developed through careful study of Sumerian texts and cross-referenced with ancient astronomical records and mythological traditions, proposed an answer that, while controversial, fits remarkably well with the evidence we possess. The Sitchin research suggested that the Anunnaki required gold from Earth. Not gold for purposes of decoration, not gold for purposes of wealth accumulation or status display, but gold for technological purposes. Specifically, gold may have been needed for advanced technological applications, possibly atmospheric engineering, possibly biological modification protocols, possibly technologies whose precise nature we can only speculate about. The Anunnaki homeworld, according to various mythological traditions, faced environmental or technological challenges, or logical challenges that required specific resources. Gold, with its unique electrical and thermal properties, its resistance to degradation, its remarkable malleability and conductivity, could have served critical functions in advanced technology. If this hypothesis is correct, Bad Tabira becomes something far more significant than merely a city. It becomes an industrial complex of unprecedented scale. It becomes a multi-generational resource extraction and processing operation. The 3 kings who ruled it were not governing a population of independent miners and craftspeople in a human sense. They were overseeing the continuation of an organized, systematized, continental-scale extraction project, one so vast and complex in its scope that its successful execution required over 100,000 years of continuous, uninterrupted operation. The metallurgical remains found in archaeological excavations of ancient Mesopotamia, copper artifacts, bronze works, gold pieces of extraordinary sophistication, suggest that the technology available to these ancient peoples far exceeded what we would expect from purely human development operating in isolation. The efficiency of the ancient metallurgical operations is striking. The scale is remarkable. The precision is extraordinary. The consistency of quality across different locations and across vast spans of time speaks to standardized processes and centralized control. These characteristics should not exist in a prehistorical society where knowledge was not formally recorded and transmitted, where there was no institutional memory, where technological innovation typically proceeded through trial and error over generations. Bad Tabira was not preceded by centuries of primitive experimentation in metalworking. It did not emerge from gradual refinement of earlier, cruder techniques. It was a fully functional industrial state from its inception, complete with technological protocols, with organized labor structures, with quality controls, with systematic processes. It was ruled by entities whose extended lifespans, each reigning for tens of thousands of years, allowed them to oversee projects so vast and so long-term that no human being could conceivably supervise or coordinate. A project requiring 100,000 years of continuous operation could not be managed by a succession of human kings, each ruling for perhaps 50 or 100 years. The institutional knowledge would be lost, the protocols would degrade, the quality would decline, the continuity would break. But if the ruler possessed a lifespan of 43,200 years, as Enmen-Luana did, then that single individual could oversee the entire project, maintain direct continuity of vision and protocol, ensure consistency of execution, and guarantee that long-term goals were sustained even as individual workers rotated, as generations of laborers rose and fell. Bad Tabira was not a human city. It was an industrial installation. The industrial age of antediluvian Mesopotamia was not a human discovery achieved through gradual innovation and experimentation. It was an installed phase of a non-human civilization's resource extraction operation. The city's names, the reign lengths, the chronological precision, all of it speaks to organization and purpose. The Sumerian King List recorded it with precision and chronological detail. In the reign lengths and the names of cities that spoke to anyone capable of reading them, it conveyed a truth. This was not mythology. This was not religious theology. This was administration. This was resource management. This was a civilization that had not emerged organically from human ingenuity, but had descended from the sky with purposes that we are only beginning to glimpse and understand. The kingship moved again, following a systematic progression that was beginning to reveal itself as methodical and deliberate. Now, the seat of authority moved to Larak, a city that appears in the ancient texts with an enigmatic character, often described in fragmentary manuscripts with language that speaks to function rather than to identity or theological significance. Larak appears in various ancient sources as a mysterious city, sometimes called the hidden regulator in older textual fragments, sometimes referred to as the city of observation or the place of reckoning. Unlike Eridu, which had explicit theological associations with Enki and clear administrative purposes, or unlike Bad Tabira, which was transparently an industrial complex devoted to metallurgical processing, Larak was described in the ancient texts in terms of function and role rather than in terms of simple identity. It was a city of governance, of regulation, of systems management. It was the node through which information flowed. It was the center from which commands were issued. It was the place where the interconnected system that had been established across Mesopotamia was coordinated and controlled. Larak was ruled by a single king named Ensipaziana, who reigned for 28,800 years. This represents exactly 8 SAR cycles, a complete mathematical octave in the Sumerian sexagesimal system. The number itself is significant and communicates deliberate design. 8 Saudi riyals, 8 cycles, 8 measures, 8 complete iterations of the sacred 3,600-year unit. The mathematical precision speaks to intentionality. Whatever purpose Larak served, it was designed as a complete, closed system with a defined duration and a mathematical completeness to its function. 8 Saudi riyal was not arbitrary, it was calculated. It was the precise measure of time required for Larak to fulfill its assigned role in the broader system. In the context of an installed civilization with distributed cities serving specific functions, Larak would have been the regulatory hub, the system's management center, the coordination nexus, where Eridu was infrastructure and establishment, where Bad Tabira was production and extraction, Larak was oversight and calibration. The technological systems put in place during the antediluvian era, the agricultural systems, the administrative networks, the communication protocols, the resource distribution channels, all of this required management, adjustment, and continuous coordination. Larak was the command center. Larak was the place where any problems or inefficiencies would be identified, analyzed, and corrected through issued directives. Ensipaziana, ruling for a complete 8 SAR cycle, Ensu, read that whatever regulatory function Larak served was carried out with total consistency and total continuity. Then came Sipar. The kingship moved from the regulatory center to a city of profound cosmic and theological significance in Sumerian civilization. Sipar held exceptional meaning in the Sumerian religious and astronomical tradition. It was the city of Utu, the sun god, the deity most directly associated with justice, clarity, truth, and celestial order. Utu was not simply a religious figure. Utu was associated with astronomy, with the measurement of time, with the observation of celestial cycles, with the precision and clarity that characterized cosmic order. To place the kingship in Sipar was to establish a connection to the highest levels of cosmic authority and cosmic order. But in the King List, Sipar takes on a different meaning than it might have held in purely theological contexts. In the chronological record, Sipar's king was Enmendurana, who reigned for 21,000 years. This represents 5.833 repeating SAR cycles, an incomplete cycle, a measurement that refused to complete itself into a whole number of sacred units. The incompleteness is significant. It signals that what was happening at Sipar was different from what had occurred in previous cities. Here, the Sumerian sources break from their pattern. Instead of simply recording the reign length and then moving methodically to the next city and the next king, the ancient texts insert something extraordinary. They tell us something remarkable about Enmendurana that they did not tell us about any of the previous antediluvian kings. The text records, Enmendurana was summoned to heaven. This is not a description of death. Enmendurana did not die and pass into the underworld according to human theology. The text does not say he abdicated or that he was overthrown. It says precisely this: he was summoned to heaven. He was called. He was beckoned. He was recalled from earth back to the celestial realm from which kingship had originally descended millennia before. This is the moment of knowledge transfer. This is the critical juncture when secrets were being collected, consolidated, and systematically removed from the terrestrial archive to preserve them in the celestial realm. Enmendurana, before his summoning, was said to have received the Me, the divine laws, the cosmic ordinances, the technological protocols, and scientific knowledge that governed civilization itself. He was given not merely political authority, but the complete knowledge base. He was given the information to preserve, to encode, to pass on to future generations in a form that could survive the cataclysm that was coming. The cities of Larak and Sipar together represent the final regulatory and consolidation phase of the antediluvian civilization. The systems had been established. The infrastructure was in place. The resource extraction was proceeding systematically. The population was being managed according to protocol. The technology was functioning according to design. The knowledge was being deepened and refined, and then it was being consolidated and elevated, removed from the terrestrial sphere and returned to the celestial realm where it could be preserved against what was approaching. Something was coming. The text does not announce it explicitly with dramatic proclamation. The structure itself communicates the message. The progression was entering its final cycle. The civilization was being prepared for a transition. The knowledge was being secured. The warnings were being given to those who needed to receive them. The architects of the system were taking steps to ensure that what they had built would not be completely erased, that some record would survive, that some memory would persist. The kingship moved one final time in the antediluvian sequence, moving to a city that would become legendary in the mythological traditions of multiple ancient cultures. Shuruppak, the final capital, the place of the last warning, the threshold between two worlds. Shuruppak was the capital of Ubaratutu, recorded in the King List as the eighth and final antediluvian king. He reigned for 18,600 years, which represents 5 1/6 SAR cycles. The number is significant in its incompleteness. It is not a whole number of Saudi Arabian rial units. It does not resolve into mathematical symmetry. It is a measurement that breaks off mid-sequence, as if the chronological record itself was interrupted, severed, cut short before it could reach completion. Because it was. The flood interrupted everything. The rain was cut off. The cycle was broken. The incompleteness of the number itself communicates the rupture that was approaching. But Ubaratutu's significance extends far beyond his position as the eighth name in the King List. Ubaratutu appears in the Sumerian and Akkadian mythological texts as far more than a mere administrator or regulatory figure. He appears as the father of Ziusudra, the character most directly associated with the preservation of knowledge and the survival of the coming catastrophe. Ziusudra is known by other names in different ancient traditions. Utnapishtim in the Akkadian myths, the character we recognize as the Sumerian Noah in Judeo-Christian tradition. He is the flood survivor. He is the vessel bearer. He is the one who carried forward the knowledge into the post-flood world. The connection between Ubaratutu and Ziusudra is crucial to understanding what was happening in the final days before the flood. The last antediluvian king was not simply maintaining the systems that had been established. He was receiving communication. He was being warned. He was being prepared for the catastrophe that was approaching. In the epic texts, the Anunnaki Council, the assembly of celestial entities who oversaw the antediluvian civilization, made a decision of cosmic consequence. The experiment was ending. The civilization that had been installed, that had been refined and maintained and operated for 241,200 years, would be deliberately erased. A cataclysm would sweep over the earth. A flood of continental scale would wipe the existing slate completely clean. Everything would be destroyed. The infrastructure would be buried. The cities would be inundated. The knowledge would be lost unless specific measures were taken to preserve it. But before the waters came, the warning was given. Ubaratutu was told. He was informed of what was approaching. The message was passed from the celestial authorities to the last earthly king. The decree was explicit. A deluge would come. The old world would end. But there was a way to survive. There was a protocol for preservation. Ubaratutu received the warning and transmitted it to his son Ziusudra. The message was, build a vessel, not a small boat or a raft, but a constructed structure specifically designed to preserve knowledge and specimens and the essential information needed to rebuild civilization after the waters receded. Gather the knowledge, collect the records, preserve what could be preserved, build the archive, construct the vessel. When the waters come, this vessel will float above the destruction. This vessel will survive. And from this vessel, the knowledge will be carried forward into the world that comes after. The Sumerian King List is not merely a chronicle of royal succession. It is not simply a genealogical record of who ruled and for how long. It is the preamble to an apocalypse. Every reign, every city, every SAR cycle was orchestrated as a progression leading toward this moment. The establishment at Eridu, the industrial production at Bad Tabira, the regulatory management at Larak, the knowledge consolidation at Sipar, the final warning at Shurupak. The structure of the antediluvian civilization was a project with a definite deadline, a project with a predetermined endpoint, a civilization designed with an expiration date built into its very architecture. The last king knew the end was near. The text places him at Shurupak, at the precise threshold between eras. His reign was incomplete, 5 1/6 SAR, a number that refused to complete itself, as if the chronology itself was interrupted mid-sentence by the force of external events. And it was. The flood interrupted everything. The destruction that followed cut short the reign before it could conclude, according to whatever original plan had been established. But the warning had been given. The protocol had been transmitted. The knowledge had been encoded and secured. Ubara Tutu had done what was required of him. The message had reached Zeusudra. The vessel was being built. The archive was being constructed. The records were being gathered. Everything that could be done to preserve the knowledge of the antediluvian civilization was being done. And when the waters came, what could be saved would be saved. What could be carried forward would be carried forward. The ancient Sumerian texts use a singular, stark phrase to mark the absolute transition between ages, between worlds, between states of existence. The words appear in the King List with no preamble and no elaboration. Then the flood swept over. Not a metaphor, not poetic description employed for emotional effect, not a mythological embellishment designed to inspire awe or terror. A statement, a historical marker, a chronological dividing line, a BU, the Great Flood, a cataclysm so total in its scope, so comprehensive in its destructive power, that it brought an absolute end not merely to a single reign or to a single dynasty, but to an entire epoch of civilization. An entire world was erased. The texts describe the flood with vivid and almost cinematographic language. The waters rose, not gradually, but with tremendous force and speed. They inundated the land. They covered the cities. They swept across the landscape. Eridu, the first capital, where kingship had originally descended from heaven, submerged beneath torrents of water. Bad Tabira, the fortress of the metal workers, the industrial complex where countless workers had labored for more than 100,000 years to extract and process metals, buried beneath sediment and silt and water. Larak, the regulatory center, the place of observation and control, swept away. Sipar, the city of celestial knowledge and cosmic order, inundated completely. Shurupak, where the final warning had been issued, covered by water so deep that there was no trace of it remained visible. All of them, every city of the antediluvian civilization, all of them erased from the landscape in a single catastrophic event. Entire landscapes were transformed. The topography was altered, geographic features were displaced, the elevation of the land itself changed. Geological strata were superimposed upon one another. The physical evidence of what had existed before was buried under meters and sometimes tens of meters of sediment and silt deposited by the flood. Archaeological evidence uncovered through modern excavation confirms the reality of this catastrophic inundation event. In the strata of Mesopotamian excavation sites, particularly at Ur and other ancient centers, there are distinct layers of sediment that represent catastrophic flooding. These are not the gradual, annual deposits left by the normal flooding of rivers. These are the massive sediment layers of a continental deluge, a flooding event of such magnitude that it left permanent and unmistakable geological markers. Markers that are traceable by modern archaeologists and geologists using sophisticated analysis techniques. The flood was not a local river overflow. The flood was not a seasonal phenomenon. The flood was a cataclysm of continental scale. The flood was not a natural phenomenon that happened to occur at the end of the antediluvian period, as if by cosmic coincidence or random natural disaster. The flood was deliberate. It was engineered. It was the mechanism of erasure. It was the cosmic reset button, activated by decision and by design. The civilization that had been installed was being uninstalled. The systems were being shut down. The infrastructure was being destroyed. The knowledge was being systematically erased from the landscape itself. Consider what the flood accomplished in terms of information and knowledge preservation. It destroyed the physical infrastructure of antediluvian civilization completely. The cities were buried under sediment so deep that their location became lost. The monuments were swept away or buried beyond recognition. The artifacts were scattered or broken or buried. The records carved into stone, if any such records existed beyond the clay tablets that were being deliberately preserved, were destroyed or rendered inaccessible. The evidence of the civilization's technological sophistication was erased from immediate access. The monuments that might have communicated the truth about antediluvian knowledge were destroyed. But before the waters came, copies of the records were made. The Sumerian King List, preserved on clay tablets that could be baked and transported and hidden, was passed forward to those who would survive the flood. The knowledge was maintained in texts that could be written and rewritten and transmitted from one generation to the next. The flood destroyed the physical world, but could not destroy the written record. It destroyed the cities, but not the knowledge. It erased the infrastructure, but not the information. The 241,200-year reign of the 8 antediluvian kings ended not with a gradual transition or a natural conclusion or a peaceful succession. It ended with cataclysm. It ended with water and destruction and absolute transformation of the terrestrial landscape. The entire civilization that had been installed over 250,000 years was swept away in a single event. Millennia of construction and development were destroyed in what may have been a period of days or weeks. The civilization was being uninstalled, systematically and completely, deliberately and absolutely. Yet the list remained. The record survived. The chronology persisted. The mathematics was preserved. Why? Why was this document not destroyed like everything else? Why was this record not lost like the cities were lost? Because whoever preserved it, whoever made the deliberate choice to copy it onto tablets that could be transported and hidden and passed forward, understood with absolute certainty that the truth needed to be maintained. The truth needed to be encoded in the chronological record. The truth needed to be preserved in a form that could be discovered by future generations. The flood was not meant to erase the knowledge entirely. It was meant to reset the world, to wash away the old civilization, to remove the evidence of what had existed before, and to begin again with a new template, a post-flood world, a world where humanity would be given a fresh start, where the population would be reset, where memories would be erased and new cultures would grow, but where the ancient record would remain, waiting to be rediscovered. The King List was left as evidence, left as testimony, left as a message across time. After the flood swept over, after the waters receded from the landscape, after the devastation was complete and the old civilization had been thoroughly erased from the physical world, the Sumerian King List makes a remarkable and pivotal statement. The text returns to the same formula used at the absolute beginning of the antediluvian epoch. Kingship descended a second time. The formula repeats. The structure echoes. The language is identical to what appeared at the beginning of the document. Kingship descended. Authority came from the sky once more. Legitimacy arrived from the celestial realm. But the nature of that authority had been transformed fundamentally, radically, and irreversibly. Everything had changed except the formal mechanism of transmission. The post-flood kings appeared in the list with reign lengths that, while still extended compared to modern human lifespans, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the antediluvian epochs. They bore no similarity to the SAR multiples that had characterized the 8 pre-flood kings. The first post-flood dynasty, the dynasty of Kish according to some versions of the list, included figures like Gilgamesh, who reigned for 126 years, and Mebaragesi of Kish, who ruled for 134 years, Aga of Kish, who governed for 625 years. These numbers, while certainly extended and remarkable by modern standards, could theoretically be attributed to exceptional longevity, to rare genetic advantages, perhaps to exaggeration in the record, or to the accumulation of multiple reigns being attributed to a single figure. They were human timescales, measured in centuries rather than millennia. They were scaled to biological parameters that, while extreme, were theoretically possible for human beings in exceptional cases. This is the key transition, the critical shift in the narrative of human history. From SAR multiples to human measures, from entities with lifespans of tens of thousands of years to beings who aged and died within a few centuries, from non-human administrators overseeing an installed civilization to human dynasties receiving responsibility for stewardship over a new world. The shift was fundamental. The shift was deliberate. The shift was total. The second descent of kingship came with radically different parameters than the first. The post-flood kings were not non-human entities, descended from the celestial realm to oversee the initial installation and operation of civilization. They were human beings, selected from among the population or arriving after the flood from hidden refuges, granted authority by those who had come before, given the responsibility of stewardship and management over a new world that had been reset and prepared for a fresh beginning. But more significantly, far more significantly than the change in the kings themselves, the post-flood kings received something crucial that shaped everything that followed. They received the King List itself. They inherited the record of their predecessors. They possessed the chronology. They had access to the mathematics. They could study the names of the cities and understand the phases of the antediluvian civilization. They could claim legitimacy through succession, not by their own right or their own accomplishments, but by virtue of continuity with the antediluvian order that had preceded them. This is when the conspiracy took its truest form. This is when the deliberate obscuration of truth became a conscious, systematic project. The post-flood dynasties faced a fundamental crisis of authority. They ruled over a world that had been reset, populated largely by humans who had no memory of what came before, who did not understand the nature of the civilization that had existed in the antediluvian era, who could only access the knowledge through the texts and traditions that the new rulers chose to transmit. The post-flood rulers kept the list. They maintained it. They had it copied and recopied. They ensured its preservation across dynasties and across the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian rule. But they made a political calculation about how the list would be interpreted and transmitted to future generations. They could point to the King List and say to their subjects, "We are the rightful heirs to an order established in the heavens. We rule with the same authority that governed the 8 before us. We are the continuation of that cosmic order. Our legitimacy is not based on military power alone or on dynastic succession alone. Our legitimacy is cosmic. It is celestial. It is written in the oldest record of civilization itself." But simultaneously, they ensured that the pre-flood kings would be classified as mythology, as legend, as the embellished theological imagination of a primitive people. How could you not classify them as mythology? The numbers were too vast to be believed by any reasonable person. The lifespans were too impossible. The reigns were too long. The SAR system had been forgotten or obscured by the time the post-flood dynasties rose to power. The context was lost. The mathematical framework was no longer understood. So the general population was encouraged, both explicitly and implicitly, to set aside the antediluvian section as legend, as spiritual metaphor, as the theological dreams and cosmic mythology of ancient peoples who didn't understand time or chronology or the limits of human possibility. The kingship descended a second time, but with it came a deliberate diminishment. The rulers who came after the flood had shorter lives, less power, more limited authority, more constrained control over their domains. They were caretakers of a world that had been reset, stewards of a knowledge they did not fully understand because the context and the cosmology had been lost. They knew the truth because they had the list in their possession. They could read it, they could study it, but they made sure that truth remained encoded, accessible only to those who could read the mathematics and understand the cosmology and possessed the initiated knowledge. The conspiracy was not the fabrication of history. It was not the invention of lies from whole cloth. It was the deliberate construction of selective memory. Keep the record, hide the meaning, pass the truth forward in plain sight, where only the initiated could find it. Classify the truth as mythology, treat it as theology, embed it in stories about gods rather than acknowledge it as documentation of non-human administration. The truth remained visible, but its significance was obscured. The numbers remained the same, but their meaning was hidden. We arrive now at the central, perhaps the most crucial question of our entire investigation into the Sumerian King List and its hidden meaning. Why? Why was the truth hidden? What motivated those who possessed the complete record to ensure that subsequent generations would regard the antediluvian kings as mythology rather than history? What political or ideological calculation drove the conspiracy to obscure the meaning that was encoded in the mathematics and the chronology? The answer lies in the politics of legitimacy and the fundamental crisis of authority that emerged after the flood. The post-flood dynasties faced what can only be described as a fundamental and existential crisis of authority. They ruled over a world that had been reset, ruled over a population of humans who had no memory of what came before, who did not know the nature of the civilization that had existed in the antediluvian era, who had no context for understanding the magnitude of what had been erased. These new rulers could not claim to have inherited their power through direct succession from the non-human entities who had administered the antediluvian civilization. They were human. They aged. They died. They were subject to human limitations. They lacked the cosmic authority and the extended lifespans of those who had ruled for ages unnumbered. Yet in their possession was a document of extraordinary power. The Sumerian King List demonstrated an unbroken chain of authority extending back to the very descent of kingship from heaven. If they kept the list, if they maintained it, if they had it copied and transmitted, they could claim direct succession from the antediluvian order. They could point to the chronology and say, "We are the rightful heirs of this ancient order." Kingship descended from heaven originally, and through that unbroken chain of transmission, it has descended upon us. If they showed the King List to their subjects and argued, "We are the rightful heirs of this cosmic authority," they could claim legitimacy beyond mere military power or dynastic succession. They could claim the authority of heaven itself. But the numbers posed an immediate and serious problem. A human subject, reading the Sumerian King List for the first time, encountering the statement that the first kings of Eridu reigned for 67,200 years and 36,000 years and 43,200 years, would face a logical choice. Either the list is true and human beings are ruled by the rightful inheritors of cosmic authority, descended through an unbroken line from the very descent of kingship from heaven, or the list is false. The numbers are fabricated, and the kings are simply usurpers maintaining power through the control and manipulation of historical narrative. There could be no comfortable middle ground. There could be no ambiguity. The numbers were too extraordinary. They forced a binary choice. The solution that emerged was elegant, politically sophisticated, and remarkably effective at achieving its purpose. Accept the post-flood section of the list as historical. Classify it as genuine history. Treat it as a reliable chronicle of actual rulers and actual events. Reject the antediluvian section of the list as mythological. Classify it as legend. Treat it as theology rather than chronology. In this way, the post-flood rulers could claim connection to an ancient order of authority without asking their people to believe numbers that seemed impossible. The subjects could accept that the current rulers represented a continuation of legitimate authority, a direct succession from the antediluvian order, filtered through a mythological prelude that explained why the numbers seemed so extraordinary. The conspiracy was not orchestrated by a single figure or coordinated by a unified council meeting to plan the deception. It emerged organically from the political interests and the structural incentives that faced successive dynasties over centuries and millennia. Each ruler who possessed the King List faced the same fundamental incentive structure: use it to legitimize their authority but hide the implications of the antediluvian section. Make it seem like mythology rather than history. Tell stories about gods rather than administrators. Transform the technical record into theological narrative. Reframe the numbers as spiritual metaphor rather than chronological precision. Over centuries, over dynasties, over the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Persian rule, the interpretation calcified. It became established. It became received wisdom. The antediluvian kings became legends. Their cities became mythological settings. Their accomplishments became divine miracles. The technological sophistication of the antediluvian civilization became magical power. The systematic record became embellished myth. The mathematical precision became poetic license. The truth was preserved in the text, but its meaning was hidden behind layers and layers of theological interpretation and mythological recontextualization. The conspiracy succeeded because it did not require the destruction of evidence. It required only the recontextualization of meaning. Keep the list, keep the numbers, keep the cities' names, keep the chronology, but reframe everything as mythology. In this way, the truth remained present in the world, inscribed on clay tablets, copied and preserved, available for anyone with the curiosity to read it. But its meaning was hidden, its significance was obscured, its implications were denied. Historians in the modern era inherited this interpretive framework, the idea that the pre-flood kings were mythological, without questioning its origins or its assumptions. They accepted it as if it were a conclusion reached through rigorous historical analysis. But the framework was not the product of evidence. It was the product of political calculation made thousands of years ago. We accepted the conspiracy that had been embedded in civilization's foundational documents, and we did not even recognize it as a conspiracy. We treated it as established historical fact. Until now. The mathematics reveals the truth. The SAR system is the decoder. The numbers speak for themselves. The conspiracy, the deliberate obscuration of meaning, the recontextualization as mythology, the hiding of the truth in plain sight, all of it becomes visible once we possess the key to unlock it. We return now to the evidence that has guided our entire investigation through the historical darkness and the obscured narratives. We return to the strands of testimony that, when woven together with care and precision, form a coherent picture of suppressed history, of deliberately concealed truth, of a conspiracy embedded in the very foundations of civilization itself. The Weld-Blundell Prism sits in its case in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Every single element of its composition, every aspect of its structure, every feature of its presentation speaks to an intended message, to a deliberate communication across the millennia. The mathematical structure that underpins the entire document, every reign length being a precise multiple of the SAR, the sacred unit of 3,600 years, proves with absolute certainty that these numbers are not exaggerations born from mythological imagination. These are calculations. These are mathematical coordinates. These are precise measurements designed by a system of knowledge that we have only recently begun to comprehend. The opening line, "Kingship descended from heaven," stands at the very beginning of the record and acknowledges with unmistakable clarity the non-terrestrial origin of authority. Kingship was not generated on Earth through natural human social processes. It did not emerge from human achievement. It descended, it arrived, it came from elsewhere. The statement is so explicit, so direct, that it can only be ignored if one has decided in advance to ignore it. The 8 antediluvian kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengal-ana, Ensipaziana, Enmendurana, Ubaratutu, and the 8th position in the sequence. Each of these figures ruled during a specific phase of an installed civilization. Each phase served a distinct purpose in the larger system. Eridu established the infrastructure, the foundational systems, the administrative structures. Bad Tibira extracted resources at continental scale, a vast industrial operation devoted to metallurgical processing extending across more than 100,000 years. Larak regulated the systems, coordinated the dispersed cities, managed the networks that connected the civilization together. Sipar consolidated the knowledge and transferred it to the celestial realm for preservation. Shurpak issued the B, a final warning, and prepared for the cataclysm that was approaching. Then the flood came. The cataclysm swept over the land. The waters rose. The cities were inundated. The infrastructure was destroyed. The civilization that had operated for 241,200 years was erased from the landscape. Geological strata were displaced. Sediment buried the ruins. The physical evidence of what had existed was covered and hidden from immediate access. The reset button was pressed. The old world ended. Then kingship descended a second time, but diminished. The post-flood kings were human. Their reigns were measured in centuries, not millennia. They inherited the knowledge and the record, but they made a political calculation that shaped history. Keep the list to claim legitimacy. Hide the truth to maintain control over the narrative. The conspiracy was born from this calculation. The SAR system, the mathematical key to understanding the true nature of the antediluvian reigns, was deliberately obscured or lost. Later interpreters, divorced from the original astronomical and mathematical context of ancient Sumeria, could not read the code. The numbers seemed impossibly large. The superstition of mythology seemed like the only adequate explanation. The conspiracy was self-perpetuating because the key to understanding it had been lost, and no one possessed the knowledge necessary to recover it. Historians in the modern era inherited an interpretation of the King List that was itself a carefully constructed narrative, one that had been filtered through centuries of theological recontextualization and political motive. They treated the historiographical tradition as if it were neutral and objective, as if the decision to classify the antediluvian kings as mythology had been made on the basis of evidence rather than political calculation. But the conspiracy had been embedded so deeply into the infrastructure of historical interpretation that it became invisible. It became naturalized. It became the default assumption against which all other evidence was measured. Yet, the evidence remained. The prism remained. The mathematics remained, encoded in the numbers, waiting for someone to decode it. The cities remained, buried under Mesopotamian soil, waiting for archaeologists to uncover them and realize that their sophistication could not be explained by spontaneous human development in isolation. The chronology remained. The SAR system remained encoded in the numbers, legible to anyone with the knowledge to read it. The opening declaration, "Kingship descended from heaven," remained unchanged across all versions, a statement so bald, so explicit, that it could only be ignored if one had decided in advance to ignore it. The conspiracy to hide the antediluvian civilization was not a failure. It was remarkably successful for millennia. It shaped our entire understanding of human origins. It dominated academia. It became the received wisdom. But it was never absolute. The truth was never truly erased. It was hidden in the open, encoded in mathematics, preserved in the structure of the narrative itself, waiting for humanity to develop the tools and the courage to read it correctly. The 241,200 years of the 8 antediluvian kings represent something unprecedented in human understanding. a civilization installed from above according to deliberate design, ruled by non-human entities with extended lifespans operating on temporal scales incomprehensible to humans, operating according to a mathematical system so sophisticated that we are only now beginning to comprehend it. They came to Earth. They built. They administered. They managed resources across continental scales. They established systems that operated with precision. Then they left, or they were recalled, or the decision was made to reset the world. The flood came. The infrastructure was destroyed. The continuity was broken. The old world ended. But the record was preserved. The King List was maintained. The truth was encoded and passed forward. And in that preservation, the architects of the ancient record made a promise to future generations. The truth exists. It is encoded. It is waiting. Find the mathematics. Understand the system. Follow the chronology. The mystery is not unsolvable. It is merely hidden. And now, we have finally found the key. We are reaching the end of our journey into the chronological abyss of the Sumerian King List. But the implications of what we have uncovered will extend far beyond this single night, far beyond this single investigation. The truth we have discovered does not conclude with this conversation. It opens a door. It invites us to step through into a radically different understanding of who we are, where we came from, and what our place is in a cosmos far more populated and far more complex than we have been allowed to remember. The evidence we have examined does not point toward a comfortable narrative. It does not suggest that ancient peoples were simply imaginative storytellers crafting entertaining myths to entertain their populations around evening fires. It does not suggest that civilization emerged through the natural and gradual progression of human ingenuity, through the slow accumulation of discoveries across generations. Instead, it indicates something far more profound and far more unsettling than the conventional narratives have ever dared to suggest. It suggests that our understanding of history has been filtered through a conspiracy that began in antiquity itself and continues into the present day. A conspiracy of interpretation, a conspiracy of selective memory, a conspiracy embedded in the very foundations of civilization. The mathematics cannot be denied. The SAR system proves intentionality beyond any reasonable doubt. The reign lengths are not random exaggerations. They are precise calculations. The cities cannot be wished away. Archaeological evidence confirms their existence. They are real. They occupied real locations. They left real traces in the geological record. The opening line of the King List cannot be reinterpreted away or explained through purely theological lens. It stands as a statement of undeniable clarity. Kingship descended from the sky. Authority came from above. Civilization was installed, not evolved. It was constructed. It was placed into position. The post-flood dynasties understood this truth with absolute certainty. They possessed the complete record. They studied it. They preserved it. But simultaneously, they made a political calculation that would echo across millennia. They maintained the list as a tool of legitimacy, while ensuring that subsequent generations would regard the antediluvian portion as mythology rather than as history. They made the truth invisible by hiding it in mythology. They told stories about gods rather than acknowledging documentation of administrators. They transformed the technical record into theology. For centuries, for millennia, for thousands of years, they succeeded in hiding the truth in plain sight. The conspiracy was remarkably effective. It shaped every subsequent understanding of human origins. It dominated academia and institutional learning. It became the default assumption. We looked at the evidence and we saw mythology. We looked at the mathematics and we saw mythological exaggeration. We looked at the cities and we accepted that they were legendary rather than historical. But the Sumerian King List remained. It persisted. It was copied countless times by scribes who understood its importance. It was preserved through the collapse of dynasties and the transition between civilizations. It was buried in ruins and discovered by modern archaeologists. It sits now in museums around the world, in Oxford, in Philadelphia, in Baghdad, in collections across the globe. Every element of it continues to communicate the same message that the ancient scribes encoded with such precision. This is not mythology. This is history. This is a record of a civilization that existed before the flood, ruled by entities whose authority descended from heaven, whose reign lengths were calculated in multiples of the SAR, whose cities and purposes followed an architectural plan that speak as to design and intentionality and systematic purpose. The Sumerian King List is not a historical artifact. It is a message in a bottle left on the shore of a flooded world. It suggests that our history is not a closed book, but an ongoing investigation into a legacy far older, stranger, and more profound than we have been allowed to remember. 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. They came from the sky. They built 5 cities. They created us. Then the waters came, and everything changed. The truth survived in clay, in cuneiform, in the precise mathematics of the SAR system. It survived in plain sight, dismissed as mythology, preserved by those who understood its significance, even as they ensured that others would not. We are left with a choice. We can continue to accept the interpretive framework we inherited, calling the antediluvian section mythological and the post-flood section historical. Or we can set that framework aside and read the text with fresh eyes, asking ourselves what story it is actually telling and why, after all these centuries, that story remains so difficult for us to believe. If the sheer magnitude of these impossible timescales has awakened a sense of wonder and unsettling mystery, I urge you to do one thing: follow the trail. Read the original texts if you can. Trace the narrative of the 5 antediluvian cities. Look at the global parallels in ancient traditions across Egypt, Mesoamerica, the Hindu texts, and cultures around the world. See how many times the same story appears. Civilization was installed. Humanity was created. Divine beings ruled for incomprehensibly long ages. Then a flood came and everything was reset. One story, told across continents and centuries. One message, hidden in plain sight. One legacy, waiting to be recovered. The Sumerian King List stands as testament to this legacy, not as mythology, not as exaggeration, but as what the scribes intended it to be: a record, a documentation, a message from those who witnessed the age of the Anunnaki and chose to preserve the truth for those who would come after. We are those who came after. The question is whether we will have the courage to see what has been preserved for us. If this investigation has stirred something within you, share this video with others who are ready to question the narrative they've been given, and let me know in the comments. What do you think the Sumerian King List is truly trying to communicate? We have more investigations coming, more stories, more mysteries waiting to be unraveled. Leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning. Good night.